One whisper in the dead of night saved a billionaire from a fate he never saw coming. On a stormy night in Chicago, a billionaire's carefully built world came to the edge of collapse. Behind the polished mahogany and glass of his penthouse office, an ordinary evening turned into a silent battle for survival. And in that moment, it wasn't money, influence, or power that saved him. It was a child's voice. "Don't talk," she whispered. Just 3 words, but they carried the weight of a life-or-death warning. What she saw that night would remain unspoken, yet it set in motion a chain of betrayal, secrets, and choices no one could have predicted. This is the story of how a maid's daughter changed the fate of a man who thought he was untouchable. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. The little girl's whisper cut through the silence like a shard of glass. Elias Vance was a man who commanded boardrooms, yet this child now held all the power in the room. Her wide blue eyes were fixed on something he couldn't see, something that terrified her into silence. The storm hammered against the penthouse windows, each gust of wind a howl across the Chicago skyline. Inside, the office of Elias Vance was a fortress of quiet order. Mahogany walls lined with books stood silent witness. A desk, vast and clean, held only a leather-bound blotter, a sleek laptop, and a glass of amber liquid. Elias ran a hand through his graying hair. At 58, he felt the weight of every late night, every battle fought in the sterile arenas of finance. He was the last of the Vance line, great-grandson of the legendary General Thaddeus Vance, a man whose portrait watched him from the far wall. The general's eyes, rendered in oil paint, were stern and unyielding, a constant reminder of a legacy built on courage, not just capital. A soft knock echoed at the door. "Come in," Elias called out, his voice tired. The door opened to reveal Helen, his housekeeper for the past 5 years. She was a woman of quiet dignity, her face etched with a gentle weariness that never touched her spirit. Beside her, holding her hand, was her daughter, Clara, 12 years old, with blonde hair that fell like a curtain of silk around her small face. She looked entirely out of place in this world of steel and glass. She clutched a worn teddy bear, its button eyes seeming to survey the room with a similar sense of awe. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Vance," Helen said softly. "Clara wanted to say goodnight. We're just leaving." Elias offered a rare, small smile. He had a soft spot for the girl. She never asked for anything, never made a fuss. She would simply sit in the kitchen, drawing in her notebook while her mother worked, a small island of innocence in his sprawling, empty home. "It's no disturbance, Helen." "Good night, Clara." The girl didn't answer. She took a hesitant step into the room, her gaze sweeping past him. It landed on the corner of his desk, where his most trusted advisor, Gregory Finch, was just placing the freshly poured glass of whiskey. Gregory had been with him for 20 years, a man whose loyalty Elias had never questioned. "Your evening drink, Elias," Gregory said, his voice smooth as ever. He was impeccably dressed, his smile practiced and easy. "A rough day? You deserve it." Elias reached for the glass, his mind already drifting to the quarterly reports he still had to review. But he stopped. Clara had taken another step forward, her knuckles white where she gripped her mother's hand. Her blue eyes were wide, locked on Gregory. She wasn't looking at him with childhood shyness. It was fear, pure, undiluted fear. "Clara, what is it?" Helen whispered, tugging gently on her arm. The girl's gaze flickered from Gregory to Elias, then to the glass on the desk. She opened her mouth, but only a tiny sound escaped. Elias leaned forward, his focus shifting entirely from the billion-dollar ledgers to the trembling child. Something was deeply wrong. He could feel it in the sudden chill of the room, a cold that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "What's the matter, sweetie?" Elias asked, his voice softer than he intended. Clara's eyes darted back to Gregory, who stood with a placid, unreadable expression. He even offered her a small, condescending smile. "Cat got your tongue, little one." That was when she moved. Clara let go of her mother's hand and rushed to Elias's desk. She didn't say a word. She just put her small hand over his, which was still hovering near the glass. She looked up at him, her expression a desperate plea. Then she whispered, the words barely audible over the drumming rain. "Don't talk." Elias froze. It was the same tone his great-grandfather had described in his journals, the quiet urgency of a soldier on the battlefield sensing a trap. Don't talk. Don't react. The enemy is watching. For a man who built his empire on logic and data, he made a decision based on nothing more than the terrified look in a child's eyes. He pulled his hand back slowly. He looked at the whiskey, then at Gregory. Gregory's smile hadn't faltered, but Elias now saw a tightness around his eyes, a flicker of something cold and watchful. You know, Elias said, forcing a casual tone, I think I've had enough for one night. My doctor has been warning me. He stood up, turning his back on the desk, on the drink. Helen, thank you for your hard work. Drive safe in this storm. He felt Gregory's stare on his back. It was heavy, questioning. Helen, confused but obedient, quickly gathered Clara. Of course, Mr. Vance. Come, Clara. Clara didn't move until her mother gently pulled her away. As they reached the door, the girl looked back one last time. Her eyes met Elias's, and in them, he saw the confirmation of a danger he did not yet understand. He had just been saved. Saved by a 12-year-old girl who had seen something shocking, something so terrible it had stolen her voice. And in that moment, the billion-dollar fortune, the towering legacy, all of it felt fragile. His life had been held in the balance, and the one who tipped the scales was the maid's daughter. After Helen and Clara left, a thick silence settled over the office. Gregory finally broke it. A strange child, he commented, his voice carefully neutral. He picked up the untouched glass of whiskey, ashamed to let this go to waste. Before he could move, Elias turned, his expression like stone. Leave it. The two words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a gavel. Gregory paused, his hand hovering over the glass. A flicker of surprise, or perhaps something else, crossed his features before being smoothed away. Of course, Elias. As you wish. I'll see myself out. Elias didn't watch him go. He listened to the soft click of the door closing, the silence rushing back in to fill the space. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He walked to the desk and stared at the glass. The amber liquid swirled gently, catching the light from his desk lamp. It looked perfect, innocent. Yet Clara's terror had been real. Children don't fake that kind of fear. He remembered the way she had looked at Gregory. Not at his face, but at his hands, just after he'd set the glass down. Elias's mind raced. Gregory had been with him since the beginning. He knew every deal, every secret, every weakness. The idea of betrayal from him was unthinkable, like a limb turning against the body. But doubt, once planted, grew with frightening speed. Elias carefully picked up the glass, using a handkerchief from his pocket. He walked over to a large potted ficus plant by the window. Without a moment's hesitation, he poured the entire contents of the glass into the soil. He felt foolish, like a man seeing ghosts in the shadows. But he would rather be a fool than be dead. He trusted the general's blood in his veins, and that blood was screaming that he had just dodged a bullet. He stood there for a long time, watching the rain trace paths down the glass. He thought of Clara. A little girl with a worn teddy bear had shown more courage than half the men on his board. She hadn't screamed or pointed. She had been clever. She had understood, on some primal level, that a direct accusation would have been a disaster. So she had used the only weapon she had, a whispered warning. Don't talk. A profound sense of debt washed over him. It was a feeling he was not accustomed to. People always wanted something from him. His money, his influence, his time. Clara wanted nothing. She had acted out of pure, selfless instinct. The next morning, the ficus plant was dying. Its leaves, once of vibrant green, were curled and brown, as if scorched from the inside out. Elias stared at it, a cold dread seeping into his bones. The proof was undeniable. The whiskey had been poisoned. The thought was so staggering it almost buckled his knees. Gregory, his friend, his confidant, for 20 years. Why? His first instinct was to call security, to have Gregory arrested, to unleash the full force of his power. But he stopped himself. This wasn't a simple business problem. It was a deep, personal betrayal. A clumsy move could be disastrous. Gregory was smart. He would have covered his tracks. An open accusation without irrefutable proof would be dismissed as the paranoia of an aging tycoon. Gregory could play the victim, turn the board against him. No, this required a different strategy. A strategy the general would have appreciated. Observation, patience, and the quiet gathering of strength. First, he had to see to the girl. He found Helen in the main kitchen, polishing silver with methodical strokes. Clara was at the small wooden table in the corner, her sketchbook open, but her pencil was still. She was just staring at the page, her expression distant. She looked smaller today, more fragile. The bravery of the night before had taken its toll. Elias approached quietly. Helen. Clara. Helen stood immediately, wiping her hands on her apron. Mr. Vance. Is everything all right? Her eyes were filled with a mother's worry. She knew something had happened, even if she didn't know what. Everything is fine. Elias lied smoothly. Thanks to your daughter. He looked at Clara. You were very brave last night. Clara looked up, her eyes still holding a shadow of fear. She gave a tiny, uncertain nod. I would like to reward you, Elias continued, pulling out his checkbook. It was his default solution to everything, a tool more comfortable in his hand than a hammer or a pen. Helen immediately stiffened. Mr. Vance, that's not necessary. We don't want anything. Her pride was a quiet, unshakable force. She worked for her money. She did not accept charity. This isn't charity, Helen, Elias said, his gaze fixed on Clara. This is payment for a service. A security consultation, you could say. He tried to make it sound like a joke, but the words fell flat. He realized how out of touch he was, how his wealth had become a barrier between him and genuine human connection. He put the checkbook away, feeling a flash of frustration. He owned half the city, but he couldn't figure out how to properly thank a 12-year-old girl. He tried a different approach. Clara, he said, kneeling down so he was at her level. It was an awkward, unfamiliar movement for him. Your mother told me you love to draw. She nodded again, clutching her pencil. My wife, he began, the word feeling strange on his tongue after so many years. My late wife, Eleanor, was an artist. Her studio is upstairs. It hasn't been touched since she passed. He hadn't been in that room in over a decade. The memory was too sharp. It has the best supplies. Canvases, paints, charcoals of every kind. I think she would have wanted someone to use them. Someone with a real gift. Clara's eyes lit up. It was the first spark of life he had seen in her since last night. A flicker of hope and excitement that pushed back the fear. Helen looked torn. Sir, I couldn't allow. It is not for you to allow or disallow, Elias said, his tone softening. It's a gift, from one artist to another. Please, let me do this. He saw the conflict in Helen's face, the pride warring with the love for her daughter. The loved one. She gave a slow, reluctant nod. Thank you, Mr. Vance. Thank Clara, he replied, standing up. She's the one who deserves it. As he walked away, he felt a strange sense of accomplishment that no corporate merger had ever given him. He had connected, just for a moment. And in doing so, he had forged an alliance. He needed them. And he realized, with a sudden, startling clarity, that he would protect that little girl and her mother with every resource he had. Gregory Finch had not just tried to kill a billionaire. He had threatened a little girl. And for that, there would be a reckoning. The days that followed were a quiet, tense chess match. Elias treated Gregory with an unnerving normality. They discussed portfolios, analyzed market trends, and planned future acquisitions. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath the calm, Elias was watching. He dissected every word, every gesture, searching for the crack in the facade. Gregory was a master of deception. He was calm, professional, and attentive, the very model of a loyal deputy. There was no hint of the poison he had held in his hand. Elias began his own covert investigation. He hired a private security firm, one so discreet they were practically ghosts, to look into Gregory's life. He wanted to know everything: his finances, his associates, his habits. It felt like a betrayal to spy on a man he'd called a friend, but the image of the dying ficus plant burned away any guilt. Meanwhile, a new routine formed in the penthouse. Every afternoon, after her schoolwork was done, Clara would go to the dusty, sunlit studio on the top floor. The room was just as Eleanor had left it. A half-finished painting sat on an easel, a ghostly landscape of the sea. Jars of brushes stood like soldiers on a wooden cart, and the air still held the faint, pleasant scent of turpentine and oil paint. Elias found himself drawn to the studio. He would stand in the doorway, watching as Clara, lost in her own world, filled sketchbooks with a ferocious passion. She drew the city skyline from the window, the birds that landed on the balcony, the worn face of her teddy bear. Her drawings were full of life and detail, far beyond her years. He saw his wife's same intense focus in her, the same way she would bite her lip when concentrating on a difficult line. One afternoon, he stepped into the room. Clara looked up, startled, a smudge of charcoal on her cheek. "Don't let me interrupt," he said. I haven't been in here for a long time." He walked over to the unfinished painting on the easel. It was a seascape of the coast of Maine, where he and Eleanor had spent their last summer together. He touched the rough canvas, a wave of grief washing over him, so fresh it felt like it was yesterday. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered from behind him. She loved the ocean, Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. She said it was honest. It never pretended to be calm when a storm was coming. He turned to face her. "Much like you." Clara blushed and looked down at her sketchbook. "You have a real talent, Clara," he told her. "A gift. You see things other people miss." It was the truest thing he had ever said. She had seen the malice in Gregory that he, in his blind trust, had missed for 20 years. Their friendship deepened in the quiet of the studio. He would tell her stories about his great-grandfather, General Vance. He showed her the General's Medal of Honor, which he kept in a glass case in his study. "They say he was fearless," Elias told her. But in his journals, he wrote that he was afraid every single day. He said real courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing what was right even when you were terrified. He looked at her, and she looked back, her blue eyes understanding. "Like telling you not to talk." "Exactly like that," Elias said, a lump forming in his throat. While this fragile bond was forming, the security report on Gregory arrived. It was delivered in a plain manila envelope by a man who looked like he could blend into a shadow. Elias read it in the locked confines of his study. The findings were unsettling. For years, Gregory had been siphoning small, almost untraceable amounts of money from secondary accounts. It was masterful, death by 1,000 cuts. But it wasn't enough to explain attempted murder. The sums were large, but not life-changing for a man in his position. There had to be something more. The report also detailed a series of discreet meetings Gregory had been having with a rival corporation, a ruthless conglomerate known for hostile takeovers. They were led by a man named Marcus Thorne, a corporate predator Elias had bested in a bitter deal years ago. Thorne was not a man who forgot a grudge. The pieces began to click into place. Gregory wasn't just stealing. He was a saboteur. He was weakening Vance Industries from the inside, preparing it for Thorne to swoop in and pick the carcass clean. Killing Elias would be the final move, creating a power vacuum and sending the company into chaos. Gregory would be rewarded handsomely by Thorne. The motive was clear now: greed and revenge. It was a story as old as time, but knowing it didn't make the betrayal any less painful. This was the man who had been best man at his wedding, the man who had offered a shoulder to cry on when Eleanor died. The whole friendship had been a lie, a long, patient con. The knowledge settled in his gut like a stone. He had to act. But how? Thorne was powerful, and Gregory was embedded deep within his life. A direct confrontation was still too risky. He needed leverage. He needed one more piece of evidence, something so damning that they couldn't possibly escape it. His thoughts were interrupted by a frantic knock on his study door. It was Helen, her face pale with panic. "Mr. Vance. It's Clara. She's gone." Elias's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, gone?" "She was playing on the balcony outside the studio. I just went to check on her, and she wasn't there. The door to the service stairs is open." A cold, primal fear seized Elias, worse than anything he had felt the night of the poisoning. Gregory. It had to be Gregory. He had seen Elias's growing closeness to the girl. He must have seen her as a loose end, the only witness. Elias bolted from the room, shouting for his head of personal security into his phone. He raced towards the service stairs, his mind a maelstrom of terror. He had let this happen. He had been so focused on the business, on the game of corporate espionage, that he had forgotten what was truly at stake. He had promised to protect her, and he had failed. The weight of that failure was heavier than his entire fortune. The service stairwell was cold and dimly lit, a concrete spine running down the core of the skyscraper. The air was still, amplifying the frantic thud of Elias's shoes as he descended. He shouted Clara's name, the sound swallowed by the echoing emptiness. He was followed by two of his security men, their faces grim, their movements swift and professional. "Check every floor." Elias commanded, his voice raw. Seal the building. No one gets in or out without my authorization. Find her. His mind was a torrent of worst-case scenarios. Gregory was clever. He wouldn't have done this himself. He would have hired someone, a professional who could snatch a child from a secure penthouse balcony and disappear into the city's labyrinth. The thought of Clara, small and terrified, in the hands of a stranger made him physically ill. He reached the ground floor lobby, a service area of polished concrete and steel elevators. It was empty. The security guard who was supposed to be at the desk was slumped over his console, a dark stain spreading on the back of his shirt. He's unconscious, one of the agents said, checking the guard's pulse. Shallow breathing. He's been drugged. The escape had been clean, professional. Elias felt a wave of helpless rage. He had all the money and power in the world, and it meant nothing. He couldn't turn back time. He couldn't teleport to her side. He was just a man, old and terrified, in an empty lobby. His phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He answered, his hand trembling. Vance. The voice on the other end was distorted, metallic and cold. You've been looking into things that don't concern you. A foolish, sentimental old man. You should have just taken the drink. It wasn't Gregory. It was someone else. A hired hand. Where is she? Elias demanded, his voice cracking. She's safe. For now, the voice rasped. You will go to your office. You will transfer full controlling interest of Vance Industries to the holding company I'm about to text you. You will do it immediately. If you call the police, if you try anything clever, the girl dies. Do you understand? Let me speak to her, Elias pleaded. That's not part of the deal. You have 1 hour. The line went dead. A text message appeared moments later with a string of account numbers and corporate registrations. It was a ghost corporation, a shell, but Elias knew instinctively it would lead back to Marcus Thorne. This was the endgame. Gregory and Thorne weren't just planning a takeover. They were executing it. He stood frozen, the phone feeling like a block of ice in his hand. His company, his family's legacy, built over a century. Everything his great-grandfather, his grandfather, and his father had worked for. He was being asked to sign it all away to save the life of his housekeeper's daughter. There was no choice. Not really. He thought of Clara in the art studio, a smudge of charcoal on her cheek, her eyes bright with creation. He thought of her small hand on his, her whispered warning. She had saved his life without a moment's hesitation. How could he do any less for her? The company was just steel and glass and numbers on a page. Clara was life. She was hope. She was the future he hadn't realized he was missing. Get me to my office. Now, he ordered his security team. And get a medical team for this man. Back in the penthouse, the air was thick with dread. Helen was crumpled in a chair, sobbing quietly. Elias walked past her, his face a mask of determination. He went straight to his desk and began the process. It was a series of digital signatures and coded authorizations, a bloodless execution of a corporate empire. With each click, he felt a piece of his past fall away. The weight of his name, the pressure of the Vance legacy, it all seemed to fade, replaced by a single, sharp focus. Clara. He was halfway through the transfer when his private line rang. It was the head of his security detail, a former military intelligence officer named Peterson. Sir, we may have something, Peterson said, his voice clipped and urgent. The woman who works the flower stand across the street. She saw a man leaving the service exit about 20 minutes ago. He was carrying a large duffel bag. Looked heavy. He got into a Blacktown car. Did she get a license plate? Elias asked, his heart pounding. Partial. First 3 letters. And she noticed something else. The man had a tattoo on his wrist. A scorpion. Elias froze. The scorpion. He had seen that tattoo before. Years ago, on the wrist of a disgraced security contractor his company had fired for violent behavior. The man's name was Novak. He was a mercenary, a piece of work who would do anything for money. And Elias knew, with a sickening certainty, that Novak had worked for Marcus Thorne in the past. Peterson, Elias said, his voice low and cold. I know who he is. I may know where he's going. He remembered a file from years back. Novak had a brother who owned a warehouse down by the river, a derelict place that was often used for off-the-books business. It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. He gave Peterson the address. Go there. Quietly. No sirens. I want a perimeter, but do not engage until I give the order. They think I'm sitting up here, beaten. Let them think that. He finished the final transfer. A notification pinged on his screen. Transaction complete. Vance Industries was no longer his. He felt a strange emptiness, followed by a surge of pure, cold resolve. He had given them what they wanted. Now, he would get his daughter back. He wasn't just Elias Vance, the CEO anymore. He was the great-grandson of General Thaddeus Vance. And he was going to war. He turned to Helen, who was watching him with wide, tear-filled eyes. I gave them the company, he said simply. They will release her now. It's going to be all right. He was lying. He knew men like Thorne and Novak. They didn't leave witnesses. Giving them the company hadn't bought Clara's safety. It had only bought him a little time. Time he now had to use to do what the police couldn't. He went to the general's portrait and pressed a hidden panel beside the frame. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a steel safe. Inside, nestled in velvet, was an old, heavy Colt M1911 pistol. It was his great-grandfather's service weapon from the war. Elias hadn't touched it in 30 years. His hand was steady as he picked it up. The steel was cold and solid, a piece of history, a promise. He looked up at the general's painted eyes. Time to do what's right, he whispered. Even when you're terrified. The warehouse district by the river was a forgotten part of the city. Rusting brick buildings stood like skeletons against the gray, overcast sky. Rain had started to fall again, a cold, persistent drizzle that slicked the cracked asphalt. Elias, hidden in the back of an unmarked van a block away from the Target warehouse, watched the building through a pair of binoculars. Peterson sat beside him, a tactical map glowing on a tablet in his lap. We have teams covering all exits, Peterson reported in a low voice. Thermal scans show 2 heat signatures on the second floor. One large, one small and stationary. Clara. A knot of ice formed in Elias's stomach. Have they called? Elias asked. No, sir. The transfer went through 20 minutes ago. They should have released her by now. It was as Elias feared. They weren't going to let her go. They were tying up loose ends. He felt a surge of cold fury. He had played by their rules, and they had betrayed him. We're not waiting for a call, Elias said, his voice hard. He checked the old pistol tucked into the waistband at the small of his back. It felt heavy and alien. We're going in. Sir, that's not advisable, Peterson began. Let my team handle this. It's what we're trained for. She saved my life, Peterson. I'm not going to sit in a van while other men fight to save hers. I'm going in with you. His tone left no room for argument. He wasn't asking. He was the great-grandson of a general, and this was his battlefield. The team moved with silent, ghostly efficiency. They breached a side door, flowing into the cavernous ground floor of the warehouse. It was a maze of dusty crates and abandoned machinery. The only sounds were the dripping of water from the leaky roof and the whisper of their own movements. They ascended a set of rusted metal stairs, their weapons raised. As they reached the second-floor landing, they heard voices. One was the cold, metallic rasp from the phone call, Novak. The other was smooth and familiar, dripping with arrogance. Gregory Finch. The transfer is complete, Gregory was saying. Thorne has the company. It's over. Not quite, Novak's voice replied. What about the girl? She's a witness. Elias peeked around the corner. He could see them now. They were in a small, makeshift office. Gregory was pacing, a nervous energy about him. Novak, a burly man with a shaved head and the scorpion tattoos stark against his skin, stood with his back to a small, closed door. Clara was behind that door. Leave her, Gregory said, waving a dismissive hand. She's a child, a maid's daughter. Who's going to believe her? We just let her go somewhere in the city. She'll be too scared to say anything. Gregory, for all his treachery, still had a line he was unwilling to cross. He was a thief and a traitor, but not a murderer of children. Novak laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. That's not how Thorne operates. He doesn't leave loose ends. He's paying me to be thorough. He started to turn towards the door where Clara was being held. That's when Elias moved. He stepped out from behind the corner. That's far enough, Novak. Both men spun around, their eyes wide with shock. Novak reacted instantly, his hand reaching for a gun on his hip. But Elias was faster. He already had the general's old Colt in his hand, aimed squarely at Novak's chest. Elias, Gregory gasped, his face draining of all color. How? You underestimated the maid's daughter, Gregory, Elias said, his voice steady, betraying none of the fear that was coursing through him. And you underestimated me. Peterson's team swarmed into the room from every angle, their weapons all trained on Novak. The mercenary froze, his hand hovering over his gun. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. He sneered. You think you've won, old man? Thorne will crush you. He has your company. He has a collection of worthless digital files, Elias replied, a grim smile touching his lips. I initiated a failsafe the moment the transfer was complete. A scorched earth protocol. Every patent, every proprietary algorithm, every sensitive client file, erased. He bought an empty shell. It will take him years to even figure out how much he's lost. Gregory stared at him, his mouth agape. You destroyed it? You destroyed your own company? The Vance legacy. A legacy isn't a stock price, Gregory, Elias said, his eyes hard as flint. It's about honor. Courage. Something you know nothing about. You tried to poison me. You kidnapped a child. You dishonored a friendship I valued. The weight of his failure crashed down on Gregory. He stumbled back, collapsing into a chair, a broken man. Novak, however, was a cornered animal. With a sudden roar, he lunged, not at Elias, but towards the door to the room where Clara was. He was going to take a hostage. He never made it. Elias didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The roar of the old pistol was deafening in the enclosed space. Novak crumpled to the floor, clutching a bleeding shoulder, screaming in pain. It was over. Peterson's team secured Novak and took a weeping Gregory into custody. Elias rushed to the door and threw it open. Clara was sitting on a small cot, her knees pulled to her chest, her worn teddy bear clutched tightly. She looked up, her eyes wide and terrified. When she saw him, her face crumpled, and she began to sob, tears of relief and fear pouring down her cheeks. Elias knelt in front of her, his own eyes burning. He gently took the teddy bear from her and set it aside. Then he wrapped his arms around her, holding her small, trembling body close. It's over, he whispered into her hair. You're safe now. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. She clung to him, her small hands gripping the back of his expensive suit jacket. In the cold, dusty warehouse, surrounded by the wreckage of his corporate life, Elias Vance held the only thing that mattered. He had lost his company, but he had saved the girl. And in that moment, he felt richer than he ever had before. He finally understood what the general had meant. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was about what you chose to protect. The ride back to the penthouse was a blur of flashing police lights and the steady rhythm of the limousine's wipers fighting against the rain. Clara had fallen into an exhausted sleep in the back seat, her head resting on her mother's lap. Helen stared out the window, her expression a mixture of shock and profound gratitude, her hand never ceasing its gentle stroking of her daughter's blonde hair. Elias sat opposite them, the general's heavy pistol now safely in a case on the seat beside him. He wasn't looking at the city lights streaking past. He was looking at the sleeping child. The immensity of what had happened, of what he had almost lost, was just beginning to settle in. He had dismantled a century-old empire with a few keystrokes. Vance Industries, the monolith that had defined his entire life, was gone. He felt a pang of something, but it wasn't regret. It was lightness. The crushing weight of his legacy, the constant pressure to be his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, it had vanished. All that remained was the quiet, fierce instinct to protect the two people in the car with him. When they arrived, the penthouse staff was in a state of controlled panic. News traveled fast in a building like this. Elias dismissed them all with a quiet word, assuring them that everyone was safe. He carried a still-sleeping Clara from the car himself, her small weight a comfort in his arms. He took her not to her mother's modest staff quarters, but to one of the grand guest suites, a room with a vast, soft bed and a window that overlooked the entire city. Helen followed, her eyes wide. Sir, this is too much. Nothing is too much, Elias said, his voice leaving no room for protest. This is her home now. Both of you. He laid Clara gently on the bed and pulled a thick down comforter over her. For a long moment, he simply stood there, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. He was a man who had commanded boardrooms with an iron will, who had moved markets with a single phone call, but he had never felt a sense of purpose so profound as he did in that moment. He finally turned to Helen. The woman's composure, which had held firm through the entire ordeal, was beginning to crumble. Her shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. He was going to kill her, she whispered, her voice choked. That man, he was going to kill my baby. Elias placed a gentle hand on her arm. But he didn't. And he never will. I have the finest security in the country. No one will ever harm her. Or you, again. I swear it on my family's name. The use of the phrase, once a declaration of corporate power, now felt different. It was a personal oath. A sacred promise. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal activity. Elias was debriefed by detectives, his lawyers working around the clock. Gregory Finch, stripped of his bespoke suits and confident smirk, had confessed to everything. He detailed the entire conspiracy, how Marcus Thorne had preyed on his gambling debts and his resentment of living in Elias's shadow, turning him into a corporate spy. The poison had been Thorne's idea, a way to make the takeover swift and absolute. Novak, the hired muscle, was less cooperative, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The business world was in an uproar. The news that Vance Industries had been intentionally gutted by its own CEO was a scandal of unprecedented scale. The stock, now worthless, was delisted. Pundits on financial news channels called him a madman, a senile old fool who had destroyed a great American institution out of spite. His board of directors, the men he had once commanded, tried to have him declared mentally incompetent. Elias met with them one last time in the now-defunct company boardroom. They were furious, their faces red with indignation and lost wealth. Have you any idea what you've done, Elias? Demanded one of them, a man named Henderson who had known him for 30 years. You've wiped out billions of dollars. Pensions. Livelihoods. Elias stood at the head of the vast mahogany table, his expression calm. I am aware of the financial consequences, he said, his voice even. I have already established a fund for my personal, non-corporate assets to ensure that every employee of Vance Industries receives their full pension and a generous severance. No working man or woman will suffer because of my decision. This stunned them into a momentary silence. But the company, Henderson stammered. The legacy. The legacy was never about the money, Elias countered, his gaze sweeping across their greedy, uncomprehending faces. It was about integrity. My great-grandfather didn't fight for a stock portfolio. He fought for people. I was reminded of that by a child. She taught me that there are things in this world more valuable than a market cap. None of you would have made the trade. I did, and I would do it again. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving them sputtering in his wake. He never looked back. The world could think what it wanted. He knew the truth. While the legal storms raged, a quiet new life began to form in the penthouse. Helen, at Elias's insistence, stopped working as his housekeeper and became the manager of his household, a position of authority and respect. But her most important role was being a mother. She spent her days with Clara, helping her heal from the trauma. Clara herself was resilient. The fear still lingered in her eyes sometimes, a shadow that would appear when a door closed too loudly or a stranger's voice echoed in the hall. But more and more, the light was returning. The art studio became her sanctuary. She spent hours there, covering canvases with vibrant colors, her imagination taking flight. Elias made the studio a part of his daily routine. He would bring her snacks, or just sit in the old armchair in the corner and read while she worked. He learned about her dreams. She wanted to be an artist, to travel the world and paint the sea, just like his Eleanor. He saw so much of his late wife in the girl's passion and spirit. It was a painful, beautiful echo of a love he thought he had lost forever. One afternoon, he found her staring at the half-finished seascape on Eleanor's easel. It makes me sad, Clara said quietly, that she didn't get to finish it. Me too, Elias admitted, his voice soft. He came to stand beside her. I never knew what to do with it. It felt wrong to move it, wrong to finish it. Clara looked up at him, her blue eyes full of a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. Maybe it's not about finishing her painting, she said. Maybe it's about starting your own. Her words struck him with the force of a revelation. He had spent his entire adult life as a caretaker of a legacy, a steward of the past. He had never considered starting his own. He had been so busy protecting what his ancestors had built that he had never built anything truly his own. He looked at Clara, at her paint-smudged fingers and her earnest, open face. He realized that this was his new beginning. His legacy wouldn't be a corporation. It would be this child. It would be giving her the life she deserved, the opportunities he could provide, the safety she needed to let her brilliant light shine. "You're right, Clara," he said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "It's time to start something new." He started small. He established a foundation in his wife's name, the Eleanor Vance Foundation, dedicated to funding arts education for underprivileged children across the country. He put Helen on the board of directors, much to her astonishment. He took a personal interest, reviewing grant applications, visiting community centers, and seeing the direct impact of his new mission. He found a fulfillment in this that no corporate takeover had ever provided. He also began to teach Clara about her own heritage. He learned that Helen was from a small town in the Midwest, from a family of farmers. Clara's grandfather, much like General Vance, had been a war hero in his own right, a decorated soldier in Vietnam. He had earned a Silver Star for bravery, a fact Helen had never thought to mention. Elias had the man's service record framed and hung it in his study, right next to the portrait of the general. He wanted Clara to know that courage and honor were not the exclusive province of the rich and powerful. They were found in good people from all walks of life. As the months turned into a year, the penthouse, once a sterile monument to wealth, became a home. Laughter echoed in the halls. The smell of oil paints mingled with the scent of Helen's baking. Clara's bright, cheerful artwork began to replace the somber, expensive pieces that had once lined the walls. Elias found himself changing. The hard, cynical shell he had built around himself for decades began to crack. He learned to laugh again. He learned to listen. He learned that a shared meal in the kitchen was worth more than 1,000 formal dinners. He was no longer just Mr. Vance, the billionaire. He was Elias. And he was, for the first time in a very long time, happy. One crisp autumn evening, he took Clara and Helen to a gala for the Eleanor Vance Foundation. It was the first time he had stepped back into the world of the city's elite since the fall of his company. He knew people would be whispering, staring. He didn't care. He stood on the stage, not in a tuxedo, but a simple dark suit. Clara, in a blue dress that matched her eyes, stood beside him, holding his hand. Helen watched from the front row, her face glowing with pride. When he spoke, his voice was not the booming command of a CEO, but the quiet, heartfelt tone of a man who had discovered what truly mattered. "A year ago," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, "I lost a great fortune. At least, that's what the world will tell you. But the world is wrong. A year ago, I was saved, not from financial ruin, but from a poverty of the spirit. I was saved by the courage of a little girl who reminded me that the greatest legacy you can leave is not what you build, but who you protect, who you love." He looked down at Clara, and she smiled up at him, her grip on his hand tightening. "My great-grandfather was a hero," he continued. "But heroes are not just found on battlefields or in boardrooms. They are found in the quiet moments of bravery, in a whispered warning, in the selfless love of a mother. I stand here tonight not as the last of the Vance line, but as the first in a new one, a family forged not by blood, but by choice." He finished his speech in a respectful, then thunderous, applause filled the grand ballroom. He had walked away from a world that worshipped wealth and power, and in doing so, he had found something infinitely more valuable. He had found a home. He had found a family. He had found his true legacy in the bright, hopeful eyes of the Maid's daughter. The years that followed the gala were not a simple fairy tale ending, but a slow, deliberate process of building something new from the ruins of the old. The world, for the most part, moved on. Marcus Thorne, facing financial ruin and a mountain of evidence from Gregory's confession, was eventually indicted on a host of charges, his corporate empire crumbling under legal scrutiny. Gregory Finch received a lengthy prison sentence, a disgraced footnote in a story that had rocked the financial world. Elias Vance, once a titan of industry, became a cautionary tale whispered in exclusive clubs, the brilliant CEO who had lost his mind. Elias, however, had never felt more sane. His life, once dictated by the relentless ticking of the stock market clock, now found its rhythm in quieter, more meaningful moments. Mornings were for long walks along the lakefront with Helen, discussing plans for the foundation or simply enjoying the crisp Chicago air. Afternoons were reserved for Clara. The art studio remained their shared sanctuary. Elias, true to Clara's advice, had taken up painting. He was, by his own admission, a terrible artist. His hands, so adept at signing billion-dollar contracts, were clumsy with a brush. His landscapes were blotchy, his still lives lopsided. But Clara was an endlessly patient and encouraging teacher. "You're thinking too much, Elias," she would say, her own canvas already alive with color and form. At 15, she possessed a preternatural talent, her work displaying a maturity and depth that astonished the private tutors Elias had hired for her. "You have to feel it. Just let the color do what it wants to do." He would try, struggling to loosen the rigid control that had defined him for 6 decades. In those shared hours of frustrated sighs and paint-splattered laughter, he learned more about himself than he had in a lifetime of corporate battles. He learned to embrace imperfection. He learned that the value of an act was not in the outcome, but in the sincerity of the attempt. He was not just funding a young artist's education. He was being re-educated himself, his soul being repainted in brighter, more vibrant hues. Clara, for her part, blossomed under his care. The shadows of her trauma receded, replaced by the quiet confidence of a young woman who knew she was loved and safe. Elias enrolled her in the most prestigious private school in the city, a place filled with the children of the very people who now shunned him. It was not an easy transition. In the beginning, she was an outsider, the maid's daughter, who lived with the eccentric old billionaire. Whispers followed her down the polished hallways. Girls in designer clothes would look at her handmade dresses. Helen was a gifted seamstress, with a mixture of pity and contempt. One day, Elias found her sitting alone in the vast penthouse library, her sketchbook untouched, her eyes red from crying. "They said I don't belong here," she whispered, not looking at him. "They said my mother is just a servant and that you're crazy." Elias sat beside her, the anger that rose in him a cold, protective fire. He wanted to call the school's headmaster, to unleash the kind of financial and social pressure that could ruin careers. But he stopped. That was the old Elias. The new Elias knew that fighting battles for Clara wouldn't make her stronger. Teaching her to fight her own was what mattered. He took her hand. "Clara," he said gently, "do you remember the stories of my great-grandfather?" She nodded. When he was a young lieutenant, the other officers, all from wealthy, established families, looked down on him. He was the son of a blacksmith. They said he didn't belong. They said he was common. He paused, making sure she was listening. "So you know what he did? He didn't try to be like them. He didn't try to hide who he was. He just worked harder than all of them. He was smarter, braver, and a better leader of men. By the end of the war, he was a general, and they were all saluting him. He proved them wrong not with words, but with his character." He squeezed her hand. "Your talent is your character. Your kindness is your character. Who your mother is, and the good, honest work she does, is part of your character. Never be ashamed of it. Let them whisper. You, Clara, are going to show them what a Vance truly is. Not by birth, but by spirit." From that day on, something shifted in Clara. She walked into school with her head held high. When a classmate made a snide remark about her background, she simply looked them in the eye and said, "Yes, my mother was a housekeeper. She's the most honorable person I know. And now she sits on the board of a foundation that helps more people than your father's hedge fund ever will." Her art became her voice. When the school held its annual art exhibition, her paintings were the centerpiece. She had a raw, emotional style that was impossible to ignore. Her portraits captured the hidden sadness in a person's eyes. Her cityscapes vibrated with a lonely, beautiful energy. She won every award, and the whispers of the other students turned from scorn to awe. She hadn't just proven she belonged, she had set a new standard. Helen, too, carved out her own place in this new world. Managing the household staff of a billionaire was a daunting task, but she did it with the same quiet dignity and efficiency she had applied to polishing silver. She commanded respect not through intimidation, but through fairness and a deep, intuitive understanding of people. Her work on the foundation's board was even more transformative. At first, she was intimidated, a lone woman without a college degree sitting in a room full of lawyers and financial advisors. She rarely spoke, listening intently, learning the strange new language of endowments and grant proposals. Elias never pushed her. He simply made sure she had all the information, that her opinions were solicited, that she was treated as an equal. Her breakthrough came during a debate over funding a controversial arts program in a rough neighborhood. The other board members were hesitant, citing risks and low potential for a return on investment. Helen finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "You're talking about these children as if they're a stock to be analyzed," she said, her gaze steady. "I grew up in a place like that. Art wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. It was the only thing that gave some kids a reason to hope, a way to imagine a life beyond the one they were stuck in. The return on investment is a child who decides to pick up a paintbrush instead of a weapon. How can you put a price on that?" Her simple, powerful honesty cut through all the jargon. The program was funded unanimously. From then on, Helen was the moral compass of the foundation, the voice that reminded them all of their true purpose. As the years passed, the three of them, Elias, Helen, and Clara, coalesced into a true family. They celebrated birthdays and holidays together, creating new traditions. They supported each other through sickness and sorrow. Elias's health began to decline with age, his steps growing slower, but his spirit remained bright, fueled by the love that surrounded him. He was no longer the lonely king in his glass tower, but a patriarch, a grandfather, a mentor. When Clara turned 18, she had her first professional gallery show. The art world was buzzing. Critics lauded her as the most exciting young painter in a generation. The gallery was packed on opening night. Elias, leaning on a handsome wooden cane, a gift from Clara, stood beside Helen in the crowd, his heart swelling with a pride so immense it almost hurt. He watched as Clara, now a poised and beautiful young woman, moved through the room, discussing her work with an easy grace. She was everything he and Eleanor had ever dreamed a child of theirs might be: talented, intelligent, and above all, kind. One of the last paintings in the exhibition was a triptych, 3 canvases side by side. The first was a dark, chaotic swirl of grays and blacks, capturing the terror of a child in a warehouse. The second was a portrait of an old man, his face etched with worry and loss, but with a flicker of fierce determination in his eyes. The third, and largest, canvas was an explosion of brilliant, hopeful color. A sunlit studio, a young girl painting, and the same old man sitting in a chair, watching her with a gentle, loving smile. The title of the piece was simple: My Family. Later that evening, after the crowds had gone, the three of them stood alone in the quiet gallery. "You know," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at the paintings. "The general won many medals. My father built skyscrapers. I made billions of dollars. But this, Clara, this work of art that you have created from your heart, this is the greatest achievement in the history of the Vance family." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "We did it together," she whispered. He put his arm around her, and his other around Helen. The three of them stood there for a long time, reflected in the glass of the paintings, the maid, the billionaire, and the girl who had saved them both. They were an unlikely family, a mosaic pieced together from broken parts, made stronger and more beautiful by the cracks. The world could keep its stories of the mad old billionaire who threw away a fortune. Elias Vance knew the truth. He hadn't lost anything. He had traded a kingdom of cold, hard glass for a small, warm circle of light. And he had won. He had won it all. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.